Today at 6, a no-holds-barred attack on the government's handling of COVID from Boris Johnson's former chief advisor. Dominic Cummings says thousands of lives were lost needlessly. He admits to making mistakes, but blames his political masters.
Senior ministers, senior officials, senior advisors like me fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect. When the public needed us most, the government failed.
Mr. Cummings accuses Matt Hancock of criminal, disgraceful behaviour over testing targets.
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions.
He says Boris Johnson was fundamentally unfit for the job, but the Prime Minister defends his record.
We've at every stage tried to minimise loss of life, to save lives, to protect the NHS, and we have followed the best scientific advice that we can.
We'll be looking at what lessons have been learned. Also tonight, the aftermath of the Hillsborough disaster, the family's anger after 3 men are acquitted of altering police statements. Police arrest 5 as they investigate the shooting of the Black Lives Matter activist Sasha Johnson. Our special reports on forced adoptions. We hear from those who've lived their whole lives in the shadow of shame. COVID wasn't going to stop them. The Manchester United fans in Gdansk hoping for a first major trophy in years.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, the final comes 22 years after Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's goal helped United lift the Champions League as a player. Will this be his first European trophy as a manager?
Good evening and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. Once they were the closest of political allies, but today Dominic Cummings has delivered the harshest of criticisms against his old boss, Boris Johnson. In a withering 7-hour session in front of a Commons committee, Mr. Cummings, who left Downing Street last November, said thousands of people have lost their lives in the pandemic because of the failure of leadership in government. He admitted making mistakes himself, but didn't spare those around him. Dominic Cummings described Boris Johnson as unfit to lead the country. As for Matt Hancock, he accused the Health Secretary of lying and said he should have been fired. And he described failures right from the start of the pandemic, saying there was no lockdown plan. Our first report is from our political editor Laura Koonsberg on revelations that give us a glimpse into the heart of government during the pandemic.
Reality or revenge? Delving back into troubled recent history. Dominic Cummings' day to give his version of events. A verdict of failure. And an apology for his part.
Senior ministers, senior officials, senior advisors like me fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect. When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that.
The government's public position had been it was well prepared, but he revealed how in the second week of March last year, senior officials suddenly realised that just wasn't the case.
Telemaque Morris said, "I've come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all, quote, I think we are absolutely I think this country's heading for a disaster. I think we're going to kill thousands of people."
He described the original expectation, a peak in early summer, protecting the most vulnerable. But as flaws in the numbers emerged, how rapidly plans were sketched out on whiteboards to accelerate to lockdown, showing if nothing changed, the NHS would collapse, and the poignant line, who do we not save? And why did it take him so long to ask the Prime Minister to change his mind?
Do you not recognise that that was a massive failure on your part as his chief advisor, that you took so long to come to him with advice to change tack?
Yes, it was a huge failing of mine, and I bitterly regret that I didn't kind of hit the emergency panic button earlier than I did. But I was incredibly frightened, I guess is the word, about the consequences of me kind of pulling a massive emergency string and saying the official plan is wrong and it's going to kill everyone and you've got to change path, because what if I'm wrong?
Number 10 sounded sometimes in chaos. On one particular day, grappling with the possibility of lockdown, potential strikes in Iraq, and the Number 10 dog.
So we had this sort of completely insane situation in which part of the building was saying, are we going to bomb Iraq? Part of the building was arguing about whether or not we're going to do quarantine or not do quarantine. The Prime Minister has his girlfriend going crackers about something completely trivial.
And a Prime Minister unwilling to take the disease seriously.
In February, the Prime Minister regarded this as just a scare story. If we have the Prime Minister chairing COBRA meetings and he just tells everyone it's swine flu, don't worry about it, I'm going to get Chris Whitty to inject me live on TV with coronavirus so everyone realises it's nothing to be frightened of, that would not help actually serious planning.
Only halfway through,
I will first call the Prime Minister to answer the engagement.
The Prime Minister had to defend the claims next door.
This morning, the Prime Minister's former closest advisor said, when the public needed us most, the government failed. Does the Prime Minister agree with that?
The handling of this pandemic has been one of the most difficult things this country has had to do for a very long time. And none of the decisions have been easy. To go into a lockdown is a traumatic thing for a country.
Mr Cummings' real vitriol was saved, though, for the Health Secretary, who may not just be able to run away from a long list of accusations.
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including...
And putting people in care homes in danger.
The government rhetoric was, we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
The Health Secretary's teams rejected his claims. But then there were accusations that the Prime Minister wouldn't listen to Mr Cummings or the top scientists to bring back lockdown to save lives in the autumn.
Whose advice was he taking?
He wasn't taking any advice. He was just making his own decision that he was going to ignore the advice.
Did you hear him say, let the bodies pile high in their thousands?
I heard that in the Prime Minister's study.
Then a direct blast at the man he helped put in Downing Street.
Fundamentally, I regarded him as unfit for the job, and I was trying to create a structure around him to try and stop what I thought were extremely bad decisions.
But after hours, for those who lost family, for those who've suffered, perhaps this most important verdict.
Tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die.
For the first time, someone who was involved in making the decisions during this crisis has come to that conclusion in public. A claim the government's always disputed or tried to ignore, but one day will have to answer in full. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Now, you may remember that one of the most controversial events during the first lockdown was Dominic Cummings' trip to County Durham. Today, he again defended the trip, but said he should have been more open about the security reasons that prompted it. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young.
We'd all been told to stay at home, but Dominic Cummings didn't.
He in fact travelled to his parents' home in Durham.
Before setting off, he was seen rushing out of Downing Street after discovering his wife had COVID. Weeks later, in the Rose Garden at Downing Street, he was forced to explain.
I was worried that if my wife and I were both seriously ill, possibly hospitalised, there was nobody in London that we could reasonably ask to look after our child and expose themselves to COVID.
But today he revealed another version of events.
My wife called saying there's a gang of people outside saying they're going to break into the house and kill everybody inside.
So it was actually repeated security threats which prompted the move to Durham. But when the story erupted, Mr Cummings decided not to mention that.
Now, at this point, I made just a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake, which I'm extremely sorry about. So I ended up giving the whole Rose Garden thing, where what I said was true, but we left out a kind of crucial part of it all. And the whole thing was a complete disaster. And the truth is, and that it undermined public confidence in the whole thing.
The most bizarre part of Mr Cummings' original story was the now infamous drive to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight after being ill with COVID.
I think if I was going to make up a story, I'd have come up with a hell of a lot better story than that one, right?
You are testing your eyesight with your wife and child in the car with you.
It didn't seem crazy at the time, and obviously I wish I'd never heard of Barnard Castle, and I wish I'd never gone, and I wish the whole nightmare had never happened.
After his evidence today, it's his colleagues still in government who'll be having nightmares. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's talk now to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, who's in Westminster. Laura, a day of revelations, as I was saying, but I guess it's worth remembering that Dominic Cummings left number 10 under a cloud.
That's right, George. And Dominic Cummings is someone who, in this square mile, is never going to win a popularity contest. And he didn't leave out much of this square mile from his very strong criticisms today. And of course, yes, his relationship with the Prime Minister is now very bitter and very broken. And clearly, over time, they had a very serious parting of ways and some very, very serious disagreements over COVID policy. That said, despite the fact that Mr Cummings' reputation itself and his relationship with Boris Johnson isn't spotless, I don't think it's possible for Downing Street just to dismiss this as somehow sour grapes or just to erase everything he said. It's left the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, with some difficult questions to answer. He'll pop up at a press conference tomorrow where he's bound to have some of it put to him. It's certainly given Boris Johnson's political opponents plenty of ammunition too. And lastly, and I think maybe most importantly tonight, George, after months of the government trying to say that they were well prepared for this, trying to say that lessons will be learned in time when they finally have a public inquiry, we've had someone today who was intimately involved in making the decisions at the beginning of this emergency, saying in the full glare of the public spotlight that tens of thousands of people in this country died unnecessarily. And if the government had taken different decisions, there might be families listening to this tonight who might still have loved ones at home with them. And that's a claim that Downing Street can't just ignore forever. At some point, before or when the public inquiry finally comes, they are going to have to answer that in full.
Laura, thank you very much. During Prime Minister's questions in the Commons, Boris Johnson repeated what he said many times before, that in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, his government has at all times followed the scientific advice. Our health editor Hugh Pym looks now at what we learned from Dominic Cummings about the scientific and health assessments that were available to the Prime Minister through the crisis.
Some will contest it, but today's dramatic evidence shines new light on the government's handling of the biggest peacetime crisis in modern times. Dominic Cummings' account of the first COVID wave in 2020 is highly critical of ministers and officials. British people back from Wuhan in China were quarantined in late January. But until the end of February, he said, there was no attempt to get on a war footing. Some key players even took skiing holidays. All this as Italian hospitals were being overrun with seriously ill COVID patients. Mr Cummings argues there should have been a lockdown by early March. But big sporting events like the Cheltenham Racing Festival went ahead. He says experts thought closing sports events would mean people went to pubs instead, but this was completely wrong.
Now is the time for everyone to stop non-essential contact with others.
By March the 16th, he says, there'd been a big change in thinking with the start of restrictions, though a full lockdown was delayed another week. But a medical expert on one of the main advisory groups says none of the options were clear-cut.
Really urgent action needed to be taken, but that was very difficult, I think, for the politicians to balance all the different inputs they were getting from the scientists on one hand and from those who really felt that this was going to be very damaging to the economy on the other.
Mr Cummings slams the lack of preparation, including shortages of PPE. He alleges even with virus cases surging, there were no urgent plans to secure more supplies. By September, the second wave of the virus was developing. Mr Cummings says action should have been taken then. The testing system was coming close to being overwhelmed, and he claims the Prime Minister rejected the idea of a short circuit breaker lockdown in England. Some experts agree that was a mistake.
There was a lot of arguments in favour of taking early action in the autumn, in September, when we could see that cases were rising again and we didn't have vaccines. People had been able to travel and we'd re-imported infection back into the country, people moving around. We should have done something earlier.
The number of UK deaths is one of the highest of leading industrialised nations. Mr Cummings said mistakes had been made and he was sorry for his part in them. Adrian Hamer died with COVID on Boxing Day, aged 55. His widow Lisa says today's developments provide no comfort.
Mistakes have been made. People need to be accountable for their actions and they need to take accountability. They all need to take accountability and learn, because if this ever happens again, God help us.
More chances to learn will come with a public inquiry next year. Others will give their version of events. Some may well differ from those of Mr Cummings. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
And the latest government figures on coronavirus show 3,180 new infections and 9 deaths in the latest 24-hour period. Cases have been rising slowly over the past week, and the number of people who have now died is 127,748. In the vaccine rollout, 186,147 people have received a first vaccine dose in the last 24 hours. In total, more than 38 million people have now had their first jab. That's nearly 73% of the UK adult population. Nearly 388,000 people had their second dose in the past 24 hours, and it takes the overall number in that group to more than 23.5 million people. That's almost 45% of the adult population. The time is 16 minutes past 6. Our top story this evening. The Prime Minister's former top aide, Dominic Cummings, says thousands of lives were lost needlessly during the pandemic, and he blames his political bosses. And coming up, Manchester United are warming up for their Europa League final, chasing their first major trophy in years.
Coming up in Sports Day on the BBC News channel, find out why the IOC are facing growing pressure from athletes, fearful that heat and humidity could pose a significant threat at this summer's Olympic Games in Tokyo.
Yesterday, we brought you the story of the hundreds of unmarried British women who were forced and shamed into handing over their newborn babies for adoption in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. They're now campaigning for an apology from Boris Johnson, but it's not just the birth mothers who say they were left traumatised. Many of the children who were adopted say they too have suffered. Duncan Kennedy reports.
Jan Shine is one of the children at the heart of this story.
I had an identity forced upon me. I feel like I just wasn't the person I was meant to be.
She was born in 1960. Her mother was 18 and unmarried and was forced to give Jan up for adoption. Jan says it's caused lifelong pain.
I'm angry for the system allowing me to be given to those people. I'm angry for the trauma and pain caused to my birth mother.
In the 50s, 60s and 70s, unmarried pregnant women faced intense pressure to give up their babies for adoption.
I was 17 years old, so this was 1963, but I found myself pregnant.
Pat Tugwell felt that pressure and remembers the cruelty she faced in hospital.
I remember one particular nurse who seemed to enjoy being quite rough when she examined me, and I remember her saying to me, "Oh, well, how did you get like this if you don't like somebody doing this to you?" You know, it was really quite abusive. They were quite abusive. That was horrid. That really sort of hurt me in a way. You know, I was a human being, you know. Why couldn't I be accepted for that? All I'd done was, you know, I was having a baby, made a mistake.
Around 250,000 unmarried mothers in Britain were forced into giving up their babies in the 30 years after the Second World War. The heartless attitudes towards them was reflected in documents from the time. In one, an official wrote, "The baby is beautiful, unlike its mother." The women were seen as a baby supply chain, unworthy of dignity or respect. Some birth mothers have cast doubt on the legality of the adoption consent forms they had to sign. That's reflected in this letter from an adoption hearing, which quotes the judge saying he was doubtful about the validity of the JP or magistrate's signature on the consent form.
I was lucky. I had really good parents.
Many children born to unmarried mothers did end up in loving families. Rachel Langham was taken to live in Canada as a baby, but still says her birth mother suffered.
I feel terrible empathy, and sorrow for her, and it's terrible. But you certainly should apologise for any heinous things that you've done.
Tonight, following the BBC's reports on forced adoptions, MPs from all sides have joined calls for an official government apology to the birth mothers.
There is a huge amount of support for this motion, and we expect there will be a great deal of support within government for an apology to be issued. Every day these women have been told, you gave your baby up for adoption. They didn't, they were forced.
The children of the birth mothers agree that it is now time to act.
An apology is warranted, but of course it can't ever take away the pain and trauma that's been suffered.
The government says it sympathises with the birth mothers, but has stopped short of an apology. Those who've lived through forced adoptions say an injustice has been done. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News.
Police investigating the shooting of the Black Lives Matter activist Sasha Johnson have arrested 5 men. Ms Johnson was shot in the head during a party in South London in the early hours of Sunday morning and remains in a critical condition in hospital. Adina Campbell is outside New Scotland Yard for us. Adina, what more can you tell us?
Well, 5 people are being held in police custody tonight on suspicion of attempted murder. The men are aged between 18 and 28, as well as a 17-year-old boy who's also been arrested on suspicion of possessing an offensive weapon and supplying Class A drugs. One of the arrests involved a police chase. Now, Sasha Johnson, who is a well-known anti-racism campaigner who organised a Black Lives Matter protest in Oxford last year, she remains in a critical condition in hospital after undergoing successful surgery. Vigils have been held in the last couple of days in Oxford, where she's from, and also here in London, where she's being treated. As well as the 5 arrests, police are searching 2 properties in the Peckham area of South London and say they're in the early stages of their investigation.
Thank you for that update, Adina. Thank you. The survivors and families of the victims of the Hillsborough disaster have reacted with anger and disappointment after 2 retired police officers and a former solicitor accused of altering police statements were acquitted. 96 Liverpool fans died as a result of the crush at the FA Cup semi-final match at Sheffield Wednesday's ground on the 15th of April 1989. Judith Moritz has a story.
Hillsborough is a double tragedy. The disaster itself, 96 lives lost when the football terraces became overcrowded at the Sheffield Wednesday ground, and its aftermath as fans were unjustly blamed for their own deaths. The families of those who died have spent 32 years fighting for justice. Today came the end of the legal road as the last trial collapsed.
Does not mean that there wasn't a cover-up. It just means that the law as it is today is not fit for purpose. There needs to be something done to recognise that the 96 were failed, they continue to be failed, and not only that, is it setting a standard for everybody else who is getting shafted by the establishment.
Former police officers Alan Foster and Donald Denton and retired solicitor Peter Metcalfe were accused of amending statements to mask police failings after the disaster. But the judge ruled that Mr Metcalfe and his co-defendants have no case to answer.
This false accusation of cover-up has been whipped up continually over the years. The facts were investigated here yet again by a judge and jury. There was no cover-up at Hillsborough.
Though it's not disputed that the statements were changed, the courts found it didn't amount to a crime. The judge accepted that the defendants didn't know the statements were going to be used for anything other than the 1989 public inquiry, which was not a court of law. This is the former headquarters of South Yorkshire Police. Back in 1989, officers met here to organise the SYP response to the disaster. The police statements ended up being used for three purposes: the public inquiry, the first set of inquests, and the original criminal investigation into Hillsborough. Despite a string of inquiries, inquests and trials, the Hillsborough families and survivors don't feel they've had accountability. As Culture Secretary, Andy Burnham backed their campaign in 2009. Today, he called for a change in the law.
I proposed a Hillsborough bill when I was in Parliament to give families like Margaret and others parity of legal funding when they are at an inquest where the state is involved. That is the very minimum we should be demanding.
The recent Hillsborough investigations are said to have been the longest and most expensive ever mounted in Britain. The Crown Prosecution Service has defended its decision to bring this prosecution, saying it was important for a jury to test the evidence. But the bereaved say it's been a farce. Judith Moritz, BBC News.
In a speech at the Scottish Parliament, Nicola Sturgeon has set out her plans for the first 100 days of her new government. That's following the recent national election. The First Minister told fellow MSPs the most important priority was to lead the country safely out of the pandemic. But she also raised the prospect of much closer cooperation with the Greens, including positions in government, if talks go well.
It is not inconceivable that a cooperation agreement could lead in future to a Green Minister or Ministers being part of this government. The key point for today is that we are both agreeing to come out of our comfort zones to find new ways of working for the common good, to change the dynamic of our politics for the better and give meaning to the founding principles of our Parliament.
Let's talk now to our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon. Lorna, I guess it's worth noting that the Greens are in favour of another independence referendum.
Yes, they are, George. You know, the SNP are just short of a majority here at the Scottish Parliament. They've governed as a minority administration before with the informal support of the pro-independence Scottish Greens. But Nicola Sturgeon said today that for the first time they've entered into structured talks with the Scottish Green Party with a view to reaching what she's calling a formal cooperation agreement. Now, weeks of talks still lie ahead while the two parties look at areas where they can find common ground. But remember, both parties are in favour of a second independence referendum, which the First Minister would like to hold once the COVID crisis is over. Now, Nicola Sturgeon has said this is all potentially groundbreaking and that if talks are successful, it could eventually mean ministerial jobs for Green MSP. She also said she wasn't being driven by parliamentary arithmetic, but if it did happen, it would serve to highlight that a majority of MSPs here are in favour of another referendum.
Lorna, thank you. Manchester United are in the Polish city of Gdansk as they take on the Spanish side Villarreal in the Europa League final this evening. 2,000 fans will be at the match despite COVID protocols making travel to Poland far from straightforward. Ollie Foster reports.
For over a year, football has found a way, and so have these Manchester United fans. COVID tests to get in, quarantine on return. It's on the amber list of countries, but given the green light, the Reds are in Poland.
A bit more stressful in the planning side of it, but I'll be honest with you, once all that's done, you've planned it and printed your paperwork off. It's worth it.
I had a wobble earlier in the week as to whether it was the right thing for me to do, but I'm fortunate I've had both my COVID jabs.
Everyone was tested on the flight, you know, everyone was going to be COVID-free, so we were actually pretty comfortable in the end.
United! 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 The UK government has advised against all but essential travel to Poland, but Manchester United have used up their full allocation of tickets and they're paying half the cost for 4 of their own charter flights arriving into Gdansk this morning, and hundreds more will make their own way here. United trained in an empty stadium last night. Their injured captain Harry Maguire watched from the stands. He's unlikely to play any part, but at least these stands will be partly full for the game.
We know all fans are important because we have seen in last year, I think more than a year, Football without fans is such a different sport.
Fernandes will probably skipper United this evening. He's been a key player for them, driving them towards their first final in 4 years. The opposition, Villarreal, are underdogs, but their manager, Unai Emery, sacked by Arsenal not so long ago, has a brilliant record in the competition. He's won 3 of them. United fans have reasons to be wary. 10 days isolation, wondering what might have been when they get home, would be tough to take. Ollie Foster, BBC News, Gdansk.
Time for a look at the weather now with Stav Danaeus. Hello, Stav.
Hi there, George. Thank you very much. Good evening to you. Well, after what's been a disappointingly cool and wet May so far, the end of May is looking much better. We're seeing high pressure building in. That's going to bring some drier and noticeably warmer weather to our shores, but not completely dry. There will still be a little bit of rain around too. Now, the heavy showers which we've had over the last few hours through central southern Scotland, northern eastern England will tend to fade away this evening. Many places will be turning dry, but there will be a legacy of clouds and mist and fog across many northern eastern areas and some thicker cloud there across the far southwest. But for most dry, and those temperatures not falling much below 4 to 7 degrees. Now, tomorrow we've got a ridge of high pressure building in, so it promises to be a drier day still. We will start off with lots of sunshine around, the mist and fog clearing away from northern areas, and it'll stay sunny into the afternoon. But out west, we'll see this weather front start to bring thickening cloud, Northern Ireland, western fringes of Britain. But we couldn't make the 20 Celsius mark, finally, after a long time across the southeast, and it'll be warmer across the board. Now, this weather front on Friday will be pushing into this building area of high pressure, so it's going to tend to get squeezed out through the course of the day, but it will be problematic enough to bring thicker cloud, outbreaks of rain to western areas, the rain slowly petering out through the day. Best the sunshine, northern and eastern areas, where we'll see just 1 or 2 heavy showers here. But again, with a little bit of sunshine around, we could see the mid to high teens Celsius, maybe not quite as warm on Friday as what we'll see tomorrow, because there'll be more cloud around. Now, for the bank holiday weekend, it's looking pretty good. High pressure is going to be the dominant feature for many of us, so it's going to be largely dry, and it's going to feel warmer as well. In fact, temperatures could be in the low 20s Celsius through the weekend and into Bank Holiday Monday across the south. Chance of a little bit of rain pushing to Scotland, Northern Ireland on Bank Holiday Monday. But this looks much better than of late. George.
Stav, thank you. And that's all from the BBC's News at 6, so it's goodbye from me. And on BBC One, we can now join the BBC's news teams where you are.